a vacuum gauge, and a straight slot screwdriver. That's about all you need to tune a Rochester Quadrajet. We'll dive into the details in just a moment. I'm Tim Johnson, and you're watching Shop Tool Reviews. So this is the third part of our three-part series, so hopefully you've made it past 1 and 2, both cleaning and disassembling your Quadrajet, as well as reassembling your Quadrajet. So hopefully you're at this point now, you're ready to tune. And there's really not a lot to tuning a Quadrajet. A lot of times people, they just kind of worry and they just don't know what to do, and they think it's a complicated process because it is kind of a complicated piece of equipment. A carburetor does a lot of things. There's a lot of passages, as you know, you've been inside this now. But tuning it, it's actually a pretty simple process, and you only need a couple of tools, and these aren't expensive tools. A screwdriver, a straight slot screwdriver. You've probably got a bazillion of them. You can use a carburetor tool. They sell those flexible carburetor screwdrivers. I've got one around here somewhere, but I always grab the straight slot because they're basically straight slot screws for the air-fuel mixture, for the idle passages basically. And so you can actually get to them usually with a straight slot screwdriver, no problem. The second thing you need is a vacuum gauge. Don't cheap out on this. I bought a Bosch vacuum gauge at the parts store for about 20 bucks. Comes with the hose, comes with a couple adapters, a T adapter, also a larger fitting that you can put on larger ports, which is what we'll do. So again, you know, a $20 tool and something you probably already got in your toolbox. So buy a decent vacuum gauge. By the way, this will also test fuel pressure for mechanical fuel pressure, not for fuel injection motors or any high pressure fuel pumps, but basically some of your standard, you know, 9 psi and under, 10 psi and under fuel pumps, and you can test your fuel pressure as well with the same vacuum gauge. So very handy tool to have, and once you have it, you'll find a lot of uses for it. So tuning a Quadrajet really consists of 3 items. Number 1 is the choke. Number 2 are the air-fuel mixture screws, which are up here in the front that connects to actually your primary ports here and primary throttle blade areas. And number 3 is the actual idle screw for the actual throttle blades that actually set wherever the throttle blade position is. So those are the only 3 things. And number 1 is choke for a reason. We're not going to forget about the choke because the choke does a lot more than just helping you to start your car, and I'll show you that here in just a moment. So here's your choke. Whether you've got an electronic choke or a hot air choke like I have here, where basically a tube comes up, connects right here to this port, and actually inside this thing is just a big spring. And that spring operates this little lever in here that connects to this actual choke plate here. So that basically closes off the air when the car is cold, or the vehicle is cold, and draws more fuel in, so you got a higher fuel to air ratio. And then once that car warms up, it starts opening up like this, and then finally it stands straight up. Now, basically adjusting that choke, you're adjusting that spring against that little lever in there, and you can see as I turn this, it actually operates that plate there. So we want to adjust that where we've got just starting to open there on the spring, and so that's good there. And then you'll see you've got these little plates and little screws right here. Just going to put those in. And by the way, you don't need a lot of tension on these to actually hold that choke into place. So basically you'll see right here on the plate of this choke, on the face of this choke, it says rich this way, lean this way. So clockwise is lean, counterclockwise is rich. And again, I like to usually set it right as the choke plate is about to close. So there's a little gap sitting there, and you can see here, I've got a little white mark here, and you can see I'm right there almost in the dead middle of my choke adjustment, and then I can just tighten these screws up. And by the way, you don't have to tighten these a lot. They've got those little pressure tabs on it that's keeping pressure on that little plastic dial. But really, not a lot's different whether you've got an electronic choke or an electric choke, or whether you've got a hot air riser choke like I have. It's still operating with that little spring that's then dialing in this choke plate here. Now, why do we want this to work? Number 1 is cold start. So when the car is cold, you see like it is right here, that this plate is closed, and so it's going to draw in more fuel than air, and it's going to actually burn that and start warming up. And as the car warms up, that spring in there as metal gets hot, it expands. That spring loosens up. It kind of loses some tension. And as it loses tension, as that hot air starts coming to the carburetor, coming in that choke area, starts opening that plate up. Now, here's the other key area. What we want to make sure is when we say get 150, 160 degrees, if you're running a 160 degree thermostat, you especially want this to be the case. So at 160 degrees, you want this straight up. Let me show you why. Let's say that we're mostly open, but we're not, and that's the most it ever gets. Let's say at operating temperature, that's where the choke plate sits. Looks like, oh, okay, that's decent. You know, the primaries are still going to get plenty of air. But let's say you're ready to make that pass. Maybe you're passing a tractor trailer or, you know, what have you. You're just wanting to stomp on it, open up those 4 barrels and let it eat. Well, let's see what happens when you stomp that 4 barrel. The secondaries aren't opening because this little lever right here from the choke. So once that choke opens all the way up, now those secondaries will come in and you'll get the full effect of that 4 barrel. Especially on a Quadrajet, you see how much bigger the secondaries are than the primaries. So you really feel that difference when you call in those secondaries and open up the 4 barrel, if you will. So adjusting that choke is really easy. Once the car warms up and gets up to temperature, just make sure that that choke blade is all the way up. If it's not, again, you can loosen these screws and just turn it one way to actually, you'll see it finish opening up, or the other way where it's closing. So once it's up to operating temperature, you want that dialed in to make sure that that choke blade is all the way up, and you'll see this little lever here where it clears that secondary blade there so that those will actually open. And those are pulled open by vacuum, where the secondary throttle blades are actually controlled by the throttle or by the throttle cable. You can see the secondaries open. Even though they're opening here, they're not opening here, and the vacuum can't pull these open. But again, once that choke is out of the way, now those secondaries can open. So we've set up the choke. We've got that dialed in. Now let's look at the air-fuel mixture screws. Now you can start with setting these kind of all the way in, but gently tighten those all the way down where they bottom out. You don't want to tighten those hard because you'll actually distort or deform the actual tip. So close those all the way in. So clockwise all the way in until they seat, and then back about 3 full turns, 3.5 full turns is a good place to start. Then you want to make sure that you've got enough throttle blade position with your idle screw here to where it's actually going to run. So crank up the car and make sure you got the idle set to where it's running pretty good, to where it's not stumbling on itself and not able to run. So what you're going to want to do is to find manifold vacuum. We don't want metered vacuum. We don't want these small vacuum ports that are maybe hooked to like distributors and things like that are actually metered by the carburetor. We don't want that. We want a manifold vacuum, which is a constant vacuum regardless of the position of the throttle blades on the carburetor or where the carburetor position is. So one of those things is where the PCV valve hooks into on a Quadrajet, and that's right here. Brake booster's another one. However, on the Oldsmobile that we're on, brake booster actually hooks directly into the manifold itself. Now, I also like to pull my manifold vacuum off of the carburetor, not off the manifold itself. So again, pulling from that large PCV area is a great place to pull that from, because you're getting that constant manifold vacuum. Now, I'm using this little adapter here that's got the big end on it, so I can actually just put it here on the PCV port, and then I can hook my vacuum gauge to that. And now basically we're just going to run the car. And as we run the car, what we're going to do is adjust these air-fuel mixture screws one at a time, and we're going to adjust to vacuum. So basically, closing these things in is going to shut the fuel off. Opening up is going to give me more fuel. So let's start by closing them off, say a quarter turn at a time. If the vacuum goes up, keep closing down. So close another quarter turn. And each time, let the engine kind of catch up. A lot of times it'll change, but make sure it kind of settles down and kind of levels out, if you will. So if you keep getting a raise in the vacuum as you change that idle air mixture screw, then continue to move in that direction. Because basically we're just wanting to tune to maximum vacuum. So as that vacuum increases, continue to move that way. Now, once it reaches its peak and you turn it again and it moves the other way, back it back to that prior position, and that's where you want to leave it. Leave it right there. So now we should be somewhere around 17, 18, 15 to 20 pounds of vacuum is where we should be. So then we want to move to the other idle mixture screw, or the idle air fuel screw, which is over here on the other primary blade or other primary port. So the same thing here. Start with closing that down. And if the vacuum continues to increase, continue to move that quarter turn at a time. If it's actually getting less, then you want to back it back out and actually open those a quarter turn at a time. So it's that easy, really. You're just wanting to make those turns until you've maximized that vacuum. Once you got both those dialed in, where you've got the maximum amount of vacuum out of it, then you want to move to your actual idle screw and set it to the RPM that you want it to idle at. And that's really going to depend on your car. You have an automatic transmission. You don't want it to stumble when you put it into drive. Do you have air conditioning that you're going to turn on and idle? Again, so probably somewhere between 750 and 900 RPM is probably the sweet spot on a decent idle, where it's not too low and not too high. One of the things that may cause you some issues is if you have a big cam with a lot of overlap, which really and truly the car we're tuning on, it actually got a pretty big cam and it's got some decent overlap on it. So you can see the kind of erratic idle and erratic vacuum there. So it's hard to get a stable vacuum. And the bigger cam you have, the more overlap you have, the worse you're going to deal with that. And in extreme cases, you may get into drilling throttle blades and things like that, so you get bigger air passages that actually come through there. Not going to cover that here, but I'm just telling you, if that's where you're at, if you've got that big of a strip cam, or that big of a street strip cam, or maybe you're running this thing's bracket racing on the weekends, things like that, or what have you, then you may need to go to some extreme circumstances outside of just setting the vacuum with the air fuel mixture screws and setting the throttle blade position. So that's really it with tuning the carburetor. Get that vacuum maximized with the air fuel mixture screws, then set your idle on the actual throttle blades here, and then you should be good to go. And make sure your choke is working both at startup as well as when it gets up to operating temperature, that it's opening up all the way and allowing those secondaries to open. That's it. A simple Bosch vacuum gauge and a straight slot screwdriver is all we needed for this. Please keep track of us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Hit that like and subscribe button if you don't mind, and hit the bell notification if you want to be notified of future videos. And have a great day.